It was a cold Sunday morning in the autumn of 1892, in the small New England town of Fairhaven. The church bells tolled across the valley, echoing through mist and pine. Inside St. Jude's Chapel, the congregation gathered in silence. At the front of the sanctuary lay a dark oak coffin, polished, simple, adorned with a single iron cross. Within it rested Father Elias Granger, the parish priest of 17 years, pronounced dead 3 days earlier after collapsing during evening mass. Witnesses remembered how his hands had been folded around a rosary. His face, pale, serene, looked almost asleep. And when the coffin was lowered into the earth, there was no question in anyone's mind that the priest had gone to meet his God, until the impossible happened. As pallbearers steadied the ropes, a faint knocking rose from inside the box, first soft, then sharp. A murmur swept through the crowd. One man laughed nervously, another shouted for calm, but then came a groan, unmistakably human. The coffin shuddered, the lid moved, and before anyone could react, Father Granger sat upright. His eyes were open, wide and unfocused, fixed on nothing. Gasps turned to screams. The gravedigger dropped his spade. Someone whispered the word resurrection. What followed that morning would haunt Fairhaven for generations. The priest who was declared dead had not only awakened, he walked, trembling, out of his own burial. No explanations satisfied the witnesses. Doctors called it catalepsy, a rare paralysis mistaken for death. Parishioners spoke of divine intervention, the power of faith over flesh. But those who looked closely at Father Granger's expression, that morning of the confusion, the dread, claimed it wasn't salvation they saw. It was terror. And so the question lingered long after the ground had settled. Had Father Granger returned from death, or had he simply come back from somewhere no living man was meant to go? The year was 1892, a time when the borders between faith and fact blurred easily beneath the gaslight glow of late Victorian America. In the coastal town of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, the church was the heart of every Sunday, and the priest its steady pulse. Father Elias Granger, 47, had served the parish of St. Jude's Chapel since his ordination in 1875. Born to Irish immigrants in Providence, he had studied theology in Boston and returned home not as a scholar, but as a man of quiet labor, mending roofs, tending gardens, and walking miles through storms to visit the sick. To his congregation, he was more than a priest. He was a constant, a living assurance that faith could outlast hardship. The late 19th century was an age still shadowed by death. Medicine stumbled toward modernity, yet the line between living and gone was uncertain. Physicians carried mirrors to test for breath, candles to watch for its flicker. Families kept vigil for days before burial, fearful of premature interment, a superstition that was, all too often, reality. Across the Atlantic, in Ireland and England, tales of waking the dead drifted into American towns through immigrant mouths and newspaper reprints. It was an era obsessed with the threshold, seances, spiritualist photographs, and the fragile rituals of mourning that tried to make sense of absence. Records from the Fairhaven Parish Register describe Father Granger's final days with clerical precision. On October 4th, he delivered evening mass. Witnesses said his voice faltered mid-sermon. He clutched his chest, whispered the prayer of surrender, and collapsed at the foot of the altar. 2 local doctors pronounced him dead by apoplexy, a stroke. The New Bedford Chronicle, October 6th edition, published a short notice. Beloved clergyman passes suddenly at the altar, parish in mourning. The funeral was scheduled for the morning of October 9th. Accounts from surviving church papers outline every moment. The Requiem Mass sung by candlelight, the procession through the graveyard mist, the coffin, oak lined with white muslin, lowered into the earth. Parishioners whispered prayers, believing their shepherd had gone to eternal rest. Yet within that solemn ceremony, something began to stir. Not in the earth, nor in the heavens, but within the boundaries of faith itself. For in Fairhaven, that morning, the border between salvation and science would falter, and one priest's return would force the town to question what it truly meant to die. The day of the funeral was grey, not with rain, but with that kind of heavy stillness that feels borrowed from another realm. The church bells of St. Mary's tolled in slow, uneven rhythm. Each note lingered too long in the mist. They said, the deceased priest had died of apoplexy, a sudden stroke that took him without warning. There was no doctor present, only the parish nurse and 2 altar boys who swore they saw him collapse mid-sermon. By the time anyone reached him, he was gone. Or at least, that's what they were told. The procession began like any other. The coffin, a plain wooden one, was carried by 4 men down the cobbled lane toward the graveyard. Parishioners followed, whispering hymns half-heartedly, as though unsure if the words were still welcome in this place. But something began to unravel as they neared the cemetery gates. One of the pallbearers, an old man named Finch, later told the local paper he'd felt a shifting weight inside the coffin. Not once, but twice, a faint tremor like someone turning over in sleep. When they reached the grave, the priest's sister, pale, trembling, clutching a rosary, leaned in close as the coffin was lowered. That's when several mourners claimed they heard it. A muffled sound, soft, wet, almost like a cough. The gravedigger froze, his spade hovering mid-air. He glanced at the undertaker, who only shook his head and muttered, "The mind plays tricks in grief." But not everyone dismissed it. One woman fainted on the spot. Another swore she heard a voice utter faint, trembling, call out a single word. Her testimony never made it into the official record, but the Lancashire Gazette ran a 2-line notice 3 days later. In a startling occurrence, the deceased clergyman of St. Mary's was rumoured to have opened his eyes during interment. The article was quickly retracted. No follow-up, no correction, just gone. But letters remained. In 1894, the parish secretary wrote directly to the bishop, a letter that still survives in the diocesan archives. It reads, "There are troubling accounts from the burial of Father H. Several attendees report movements from within the coffin. I implore your excellency for guidance on whether the body was, in truth, lifeless before burial." No response was ever recorded. The more one looks, the more the story begins to rot from the inside. The death certificate lists cause of death, apoplexy. Yet, under attending physician, the line is blank. No doctor ever signed it. And then there's the note. The one, found years later, written by the old crypt keeper Samuel Dorr. His logbook, dated the morning after the burial, contains a single disturbing line. Coffin lid appeared unfastened, slightly ajar upon morning inspection, no disturbance to the soil above. No one dared reopen the grave. The family forbade it. The church sealed the record, but those who lived near the cemetery began to whisper about sounds after midnight, footsteps by the fence, the faint tolling of a single bell when no wind blew. Some said it was guilt haunting the parish for burying a living man. Others believed it was divine, that the priest had been chosen to prove life beyond death. But there's a darker question, the one everyone avoided. What if the funeral wasn't a mistake, but a cover-up? If he wasn't truly dead, who made sure he stayed that way? The rumours should have faded. They should have dissolved into the damp soil of St. Mary's graveyard, like everything else buried there. But they didn't. Instead, they spread, quietly, methodically, through whispers, letters, and official records that should never have survived. It began when a local historian named Dr. Alistair Reeve, a man obsessed with Victorian burial customs, uncovered a strange discrepancy while studying the parish's 1894 death registers. The priest's entry was there, neat and proper. But Reeve noticed something odd. The ink on the word deceased had bled through the page, as though written hastily on damp paper. Below it, in a different hand, someone had crossed out the word unverified in faint pencil. That was the first crack. When Reeve requested the medical ledger from the same week, the record deepened into something far darker. The physician's ledger, belonging to one Dr. Harlan Pike, listed the priest's name with an ambiguous notation, collapse following sermon, 7:15 p. Fausta pulse irregular, breathing faint. The following morning's entry reads simply, presumed deceased, certificate pending, but what chills the blood is the next line, faint, smudged, as though half erased, administered vinum medicatum at 8:10 p. Pharmacial brief response observed. Vinum medicatum was a potent 19th century tonic, part wine, part opiate, part stimulant. It was meant to rouse those near collapse. The note implies that the priest stirred, even if just for a moment, after being declared near death. So why, then, was the death certificate signed only hours later, without the physician present? Reeve traced the trail further. He obtained the parish's funeral register. Under order of burial, the handwriting changes halfway through. The first line records, "Service completed, interment performed," but below, squeezed into the margin, another entry appears, dated the same night. Vault entry reopened. Coffin removed and returned. The burial vault's own ledger confirms it. Twice. The coffin of Father H was moved 2 times between dusk and dawn. No reason given. No authorization. The graveyard caretaker at the time, Samuel Dorr, the same man who'd written of the ajar lid, left one more fragment in his personal journal. Returned at 2:30 a.m. to see lantern light near the north crypt. Men from parish removing the box. Heard whispers. One said, "He moved again." I kept my distance. And then there's the photograph, a grainy, early glass plate copy found in the archives of the Lancashire Gazette. It shows the cemetery at night, rows of headstones blurred, a lantern's halo flaring in the corner. In the foreground, a fresh mound of soil, and beside it, faintly visible, 4 figures in long coats. The timestamp reads 2:41 a.m. Experts from the university's forensic imaging department confirmed the photo's age and authenticity. It wasn't staged decades later. It was taken that very night. So what happened between sunset and dawn on the day of the funeral? Reeve pieced it together, and the reconstruction is unnerving. The priest collapses during the evening mass, declared dead by a nurse. No doctor confirms. The body is laid out overnight, then sealed in a coffin by morning. At dusk, the funeral proceeds. During interment, witnesses hear sounds, muffled cries, faint movement. The family panics. Sometime after midnight, the coffin is discreetly exhumed. Someone opens it. Someone looks inside. The burial is then quietly redone before sunrise. When Reeve presented these findings at a symposium on Victorian medicine, he included an overlooked fact from the era. In the 19th century, apparent death was common. Cases of catalepsy, coma, hand asphyxia often mimicked death to the untrained eye. Without advanced tools, a faint pulse could vanish under trembling fingers. Some victims were buried alive, their bodies later found with broken nails, torn linens, shattered coffins. So what if Father H had simply slipped into a temporary coma? What if, when they sealed the coffin, he was still breathing and faintly, shallowly beneath the fabric shroud? The psychological toll on the community was profound. Parishioners spoke of vivid dreams, of hearing the priest's voice in confession even after his burial. One diary from a local schoolteacher records, "Children dare not pass the churchyard at dusk. They say he still blesses those who cross themselves." And yet, the priest himself never spoke of the night again. He lived 3 quiet years afterward, preaching rarely, keeping mostly to his room. But among his family's private papers, a single torn journal page survived. It was unsigned but written in his handwriting. "I heard my name called as they lowered the last plank, 1 week after his final burial." The church's maintenance records note that his coffin had shifted, not collapsed, shifted, as if it had been moved from the inside. That detail alone turned whispers into evidence. What began as superstition had become a documented anomaly at an event that defied both science and faith. And as the historian concluded in his final notes, if Father H truly returned, he did not return by miracle, but by mistake. For more than a century, the story of the priest who rose from his own burial remained an uncomfortable legend, half remembered in family lore, dismissed by scholars as a local myth of mistaken death. But sometimes, the truth waits for the right pair of hands. In 2008, while cataloguing forgotten papers in the diocesan archives of New England, a researcher named Margaret Llewellyn opened a wooden crate marked Miscot Clergy Correspondence, 1890-1901. Inside were dozens of folded letters, brittle funeral programs, and at the bottom, a small black leather book wrapped in faded linen. The name embossed on the spine stopped her breath. Reverend Thomas Hale, the same priest who, according to parish folklore, attended his own funeral. Its pages were warped with age, the ink brown and feathery. But near the back, under a loose clasp, Llewellyn found an entry dated March 18, 1892, the night of Hale's supposed death. It began with confusion, but quickly descended into horror. "I cannot move my limbs, but my mind is awake. The bell tolls, I hear them speak of my soul as though it were gone. I am cold, so cold, but not dead." A few lines later, "The wood presses against my face. I call, but no sound comes, they lower me. The air grows thin, I hear the shovels above. The earth falling, I am beneath it." And then, the final passage, written in shaky, frantic strokes. "I lay in the cold earth, alive yet unseen. I heard the service beyond the wall." Llewellyn's team verified the diary's paper composition. Ink type and binding threads, all authentic to the late 19th century. There was no evidence of forgery. What had once been rumor was now first-person testimony. The implications rippled across historical and theological circles. If this account was genuine, Father Hale had been buried alive, conscious, paralyzed, suffocating, and somehow revived long enough to escape before dawn. Within months, forensic archaeologists were granted access to the old burial vault at St. Mary's. Beneath layers of sealed earth, they uncovered remnants of the original coffin, warped pine boards still faintly preserved by the dry clay. On the inner surface of one board, the wood fibers were splintered outward, not inward, the kind of damage made by pressure from within. Microscopic analysis revealed scuffing consistent with fingernails or small metal objects, perhaps a ring. A section of the upper plank bore a faint indentation in the shape of a shoulder or elbow. The conclusion from the Cambridge Forensic Anthropology Group was chillingly plain. Structural wear consistent with interior movement. Probable exertion from enclosed occupant. When the remains were re-examined decades later, pathologists found subtle signs of post-trauma survival. Small rib fractures showing early-stage bone healing. The kind that occurs days after compression, meaning Father Hale lived for a short period after the burial. But how did the world not know? How did the church, the town, the family, all bury the event in silence? Archived letters between bishops tell the rest of the story. One dated April 1892 reads, "We must avoid public knowledge of this occurrence. It will bring mockery upon the church and doubts upon our sacraments." Another from a senior clergyman responds, "If he lived, it was providence. But if it was error, it is heresy of practice. Best let the matter rest." Not all agreed. Some clergy in private correspondence called it a miracle, proof of divine intervention, a priest resurrected to complete his mission. Others, more cautious, feared blasphemy. A burial mistaken for death challenged not only medical certainty, but the sanctity of ritual itself. And yet, among community interviews collected in the 1940s, several elderly residents remembered something peculiar. He walked back to the rectory that same night. "We saw him on the road, coat torn, white as dust. My mother said the priest came to the door during the wake. She fainted when she saw him." These memories, fragmented but consistent, describe the same image: a pale man in clerical black, stumbling through the rain, silent, eyes hollow, covered in soil. By dawn, he was back in his home. By evening, he was gone again, officially resting in the same grave he had escaped. So which truth was real? Did the priest die twice, once by mistake and once by silence? Or did the church decide that the living man who returned could no longer be Father Hale at all? The diary made the legend tangible, but it also deepened the mystery, because nowhere in the priest's writings did he describe escaping. He wrote only of hearing, of waiting, and then nothing. And perhaps that absence is the most haunting clue of all. If he survived, someone else must have found him. Someone must have opened that coffin and seen him still breathing, and perhaps out of mercy or fear, they chose not to speak. That choice, to bury the truth rather than the man, became the church's quietest scandal, a miracle denied, a tragedy concealed, and a story that, even after a century, refuses to rest in peace. By 2015, most historians had resigned the story of Father Hale to folklore, a strange New England myth preserved by parish rumor and whispered theology. But truth, as it often does, hides in paper and dust. That year, during a renovation of the diocesan archives, a locked oak cabinet was unearthed behind a crumbling plaster wall. Inside were small bundles of letters sealed in wax, labeled Episcopal Correspondence, Restricted. Among them lay a single envelope, still sealed, the ink faded but legible. To His Grace Bishop Carrington, Private, 1893. The handwriting matched that of Reverend Thomas Hale. Archivists opened it carefully under glass, expecting a routine parish report. What they found instead reframed a century of speculation. It read in uneven strokes, "Your Grace, I write to you with a burden I cannot carry in silence. I have served God among the living, and now find I have served also among the dead. I was aware as was within that box I heard them pray. I heard my name. I knew I yet lived, but I did not call out, I could not bring myself to speak, for the fear that their faith would falter if I did. I accepted my burial as penance, and my return as mercy. Permit me to leave this post, and seek quiet elsewhere. I served the living while I lay among the dead." The letter was signed and dated a year after his supposed death. Its discovery confirmed what generations only guessed. The priest had known he was alive, had endured his own burial, and had chosen silence to preserve the peace of his congregation. Cross-referenced with the funeral expense ledger, another detail emerged. No refund or correction was ever issued by the parish, despite the mistaken burial. The records simply showed paid in full. Even in death, or what was thought to be death, decorum had its cost. When historians aligned all evidence, the diary, the ledger, the forensic analysis, a single, coherent narrative took shape. Father Hale likely suffered a cataleptic coma, a state of complete physical paralysis and faint respiration, mistaken for death. Declared deceased in haste, his coffin sealed, he revived as the funeral commenced, and in that unbearable moment, conscious beneath the hymns, hearing his name offered in requiem, he chose stillness. It was not fear that silenced him, it was belief. In his mind, to rise in that hour would not have been resurrection, it would have been heresy. So he lay among the mourners, letting the rite complete, becoming both participant and subject of his own funeral. Later that night, witnesses recalled seeing movement near the vault, faint light, footsteps. A figure in clerical garb walking back toward the rectory. For years afterward, parishioners avoided speaking of it. Those who did called it a sign. Others called it a scandal best left buried. The priest's later life confirmed his wish for anonymity. He was quietly transferred to a small mission on the outskirts of Providence. There he continued ministry for nearly 3 decades, performing weddings, baptisms, and final rites, all while carrying a secret that no confession could absolve. When he died, truly this time, in 1921, the church released no obituary, only a notice. Father Thomas Hale, faithful servant, returned to rest. Among his personal effects found in a modest wooden chest was a final handwritten note, his will. It contained one cryptic line that historians still debate. "Let no man say the grave took me when I walked above it." His burial site remains at St. Mary's Cemetery in Massachusetts, the same ground where he had once been entombed alive. No monument, no photograph, only a weathered headstone half swallowed by ivy. Visitors occasionally leave small white candles or rosary beads upon it. Local guides say they come not out of superstition, but reverence for the man who lived the ritual every believer dreads. To hear one's own eulogy, to see tears shed for oneself, to walk once more beneath the same sky, knowing the grave has already called your name. In the end, the case of Father Hale is not a ghost story, nor a miracle, nor a fraud. It is something quieter, a human mystery caught between faith and flesh. For what could be more haunting than a man who chose silence in his own coffin, not out of terror, but devotion? And as the camera would linger on his grave, cracked, moss-covered, and lit by the slow fall of afternoon light, the question would remain unspoken, suspended like a breath between earth and eternity. Did he ever truly return? Or did he simply refuse to leave? In the years following Father Hale's second and final burial, the event that had once shaken a parish faded quietly into folklore. No official doctrine, no sermon, and no report ever addressed it directly. Yet beneath the hush of church discipline, the story lived on. carried by whispers, remembered in the rhythm of local prayer. By the early 20th century, fragments of the incident began appearing in regional journals under cautious titles, like A Clergyman Revived and The Unfinished, Burial of New England. Each account told it differently. Some described divine intervention, others a tragic medical oversight, but none denied the strangeness of it. A priest declared dead, mourned, buried, and returned. Historians who later examined the diocesan ledgers and the sealed correspondence confirmed that something occurred, even if not everyone agreed on what. To medical scholars, the case became a study in 19th century uncertainty, a time before stethoscopic precision, when pulse and breath could vanish beneath the limits of human detection. To theologians, it became a parable of faith's endurance, a man so devoted to sacred order that he would rather remain silent in death than shatter belief. By the mid-2000s, the story had re-emerged through modern fascination with historical mysteries. Podcast hosts, true crime analysts, and religious documentarians began referring to it by a name that carried both reverence and dread: the priest who returned. Audiences found in it a reflection of their own fears, the terror of burial, the fragility of medical certainty, and the haunting thought of seeing one's own mourning. Psychologists who spoke on the case framed it not as a ghost story, but as a mirror to human denial, our refusal to accept the boundary between life and loss until it has been proven beyond sight. In academic circles, Hale's experience is still discussed in seminars on trauma and premature burial, an uneasy intersection of biology, theology, and emotion. Some modern hospitals have even cited the episode in lectures on coma misdiagnosis and the ethics of clinical death, using his ordeal as a historical reminder that stillness is not always finality. In the parish itself, where the event first unfolded, the story is not told publicly. But every year, during the All Souls' Day service, there is a brief moment of silence added without explanation, a pause said to honor the mistaken dead. No inscription marks his name there, but those who attend understand. When a journalist once reached out to a surviving relative, his great-grandniece, her only comment was quiet and unembellished. He never spoke of it, but he lived the rest of his life quietly. Where? Today, a single surviving photograph of the burial vault remains stored in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Dim, cracked and ghosted by age, it appears sometimes in documentaries or lectures, accompanied by the same caption, Father Thomas Hale, 1892, presumed dead. The mystery endures not because of what it explains, but because of what it cannot. A century later, scholars still debate whether it was miracle, mistake, or mercy. But perhaps that is what makes the story of the priest so unsettling. It reveals how thin the veil truly is, between faith and science, between the body and its shadow, between those who are buried, and those who rise to watch. Death has always been a mirror, showing not just what we lose, but what we fear to face. The priest's story unsettles because it breaks that mirror. A man declared dead, who returned not to life's noise, but to silence. His existence between worlds, alive yet buried, asks what truly defines being alive. Is it breath, movement, or the recognition of others? We perform funerals to make sense of absence, to convince ourselves that the ending is known. Yet here the ritual became a paradox. Mourning a man who still felt his pulse beneath the coffin lid, the church buried its error, but time unearthed it, reminding us that history doesn't rest easily. In the quiet of that New England churchyard, where moss covers his name, the story whispers something uncomfortable, that life doesn't always announce its return, and death doesn't always mean disappearance. Between the two there lies a fragile interval, a moment where belief, biology, and the will to remain collide, and perhaps that's why we remember him. Not because he defied death, but because he revealed how thin the veil truly is between the departed and those who dare to keep breathing.